Thank you. Thanks for being here, as I said, and such a beautiful sunshiny day outside. Thanks for coming in. So I'm here to talk about resilience for creative growth, why it's important, how to harness it, and the path that I've taken to conceiving, funding and launching We Are Untold and the Women of Gold project. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are on Djadjawurrung country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay our respects to all First Nations peoples. And in particular, I'd like to honour Djadjawurrung women, mothers, leaders and elders past, present and emerging to recognise the importance of their stories as part of our culture and history. I'd also like to acknowledge my privilege and how that relates to the topic that I'm speaking about today. Some of you may have been at my launch a couple of weeks ago when I spoke about some of my experiences and also some topics that relate to many women, such as discrimination, domestic violence and sexual assault. Whilst I won't be going into that detail today, I just wanted to acknowledge that I've had many obstacles and experiences that have developed my resilience, but I'm also a privileged middle-class white woman. So when I talk about resilience today, I'll also talk about an accumulation of negative bias and negative experiences and how that has different impacts on different people. Resilience is like a muscle. It needs elasticity to keep functioning. This elasticity is made up of negative and positive experiences that pull the muscle back and forth, stretching it and making it stronger. But when an amount of negative experiences far outweigh the positive experiences, the muscle is not resilient. It's stretched beyond capacity. I acknowledge that my positive experiences far outweigh any negative experiences that I've lived through. I also want to mention that I'm not a mental health professional, so I'd like to just make sure that we're all aware of that, and I'm just here to talk about my own experiences. I'm also not, oh yeah, I was meant to put that one on first. I'm not great with tech either, just you might pick that one up. So, resilience is not about toxic positivity. Everyone has negative experiences and we need these to help strengthen our resilience muscles. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about feeling the fear and doing it anyway. Resilience gives us courage to live with our fear and not be controlled by it. I'm a chronic overthinker, as some of you who are here who know me will know that very well. I worry all the time. I think about giving up all the time, and I even thought about cancelling today because my fear said, who would want to listen to me? What would I possibly have to say? But what's the scariest thing that could happen? No one shows up, or you all laugh at me and throw your lunch at me. I've noticed that no one's eating and it's a lunch break. But is it any scarier than not going through with it at all or not taking the chance? The scariest thing to me is realising that I've let fear control my whole life. And I haven't lived, not living my purpose, not connecting with people and not experiencing life. That terrifies me. And those three things are exactly what I do when I'm fearful. And there have been many times in my life that fear has controlled me. When I began to conceive my organisation, We Are Untold, this was one of those times when I was living in fear. And it was probably the darkest time of my life, but as it turns out, it was also the happiest time of my life. This is where the concept of the resilience muscle, come and sit down here. Hi. This is where the concept of the resilience muscle is so appropriate. My muscle was stretched through many negative experiences, but also through many positive experiences, all at the same time. It doesn't always happen like this, and sometimes hardship and joy come at different times. But for me, at this time, it happened all at once. And this overwhelm of negativity and positivity led to an abundance of creativity, fear, and burnout. And out of the fire, I came renewed with a sense of purpose, power, and resilience. As an overthinker, I became skilled at masking with false confidence. As a child, creativity became an escape for me. It was a self-soothing way to calm my brain. I loved performing on stage and becoming someone else. It seems counterintuitive that someone who is anxious would want to be on stage in front of hundreds of people, but that's the nature of creative expression. It doesn't always make sense. Megan becoming someone else was easy. Megan being herself was hard. After finishing school in Bendigo, I moved to Melbourne to pursue a career in the performing arts. As a young country girl, navigating the music and acting scene, you can probably imagine some of the experiences I had. I dealt with a lot of sexual harassment, unfair and unsafe work conditions. I was offered many jobs under the pretense of exposure and signed many contracts only for them to fall through for one reason or another. I was often down to the last callback, the 1 out of 2, or given the part only for it to be cut. I was told yes to a $60,000 job one Friday, and after partying all weekend and very irresponsibly spending all my rent money, I was told it had changed to a no on the Monday via my answering machine. Each time this happened, I would spiral into fear, shut myself off in a little box, and then pick myself up, dust myself off, and start again. I was like a jack in the box, and the box was suffocating. Each time I went back into the box, it was smaller, and each time I came out, I was more vulnerable, more exposed, but more resilient. Phrases such as, "the show must go on," "fake it till you make it," were embedded in my DNA. I learned so many coping skills and life skills from this time that I still use for every facet of my life today. Resilience to an auditioning performer. Yeah, come in. It's okay. Resilience to an auditioning performer is as necessary as breathing. And so there's some chairs up the back if you're here. A component of my work was focused on my outward appearance. I also constantly received negative and subjective feedback, judgment and criticism on my work, many times by people who weren't skilled in people management or care. And my work was deeply personal and intrinsic to me. This is why it's important to understand that our work, although it can be intrinsic and personal, is not our identity. I studied, performed on stage and worked backstage in the performing arts industry for 15 years and became skilled in taking direction and responding well to constructive criticism. But I was highly critical of myself and a perfectionist. And because I believed this role was my identity, I took negative criticism personally. And I can remember almost all the negative things that have been told to me, like they're tattooed on my skin. Because I connected my singing voice to my identity, when I was not in a good place emotionally, I couldn't sing. So I began to shut down my emotions in order to still be able to do my job. But then I became numb, with no joy, no passion, and who wants to listen to a singer with no emotion? After many negative experiences, the ups and downs, the intense connection and disassociating, it all became too hard, so I eventually stopped altogether. As in zero singing, not even in the shower. My fear of connecting with myself and my emotional centre led me to give up. And by not connecting with myself, I believed I had no identity beyond performing. I wasn't living my purpose, I wasn't connecting with people, and I wasn't experiencing life. This was a grieving process for me. And when people found out I wasn't singing anymore, they'd say, "What a waste." And I felt like a waste of space, like a failure, that without singing, I was nothing. So what happens when we are self-critical or receive negative criticism, knockbacks, and no's? What does it do to our brains? And what happens if our work is also tied to our identity? Our brains are wired to remember negative things in order to learn from them and help us survive. Scientists call this negativity bias. The theory is that bad experiences have a bigger impact on our brains because back in the Stone Age, our lives depended on being able to remember above all what could hurt or kill us. So we're more likely to remember negative information than positive information. This theory has been tested and is the reason behind negative ads in politics, because people remember bad information about your opposing candidate rather than good information about yourself. When we hear criticism, we hear something that is a threat, and it sparks a response from two regions of the brain, the amygdala that controls our flight, fight, or freeze response, and the medial prefrontal cortex that works on regulating emotions. They work so hard processing and analysing the criticism that it can keep the brain from responding to anything else. So if you live through ongoing stress, trauma, or criticism, your brain can get stuck in survival mode, processing negative experiences and won't respond to positive experiences. When I live in my fear response, I'm a perfectionist and I have self-critical talk. I ruminate about the negative things that people have said and I add to them, punishing myself. Your self-esteem, where your resilience lies, is like a garden inside you. You need to be mindful of what you are planting. Self-criticism and words that you say, whether in jest or not, are the seeds that you plant. These words live in your body. Would you be happy for all the words that you say to yourself to be on the outside as a reflection of who you are? If you don't want them on the outside, why would you let them on the inside? When I studied acting, one of my favourite things to do was to discover the subtext and backstory of a character. What can be challenging about these artistic explorations is that they can filter into our everyday lives. I became so attuned to every word that people said, I was obsessed with overthinking and overanalyzing the words that people said. I find it hard to turn this part of my brain off, especially when I'm in the middle of a big project, because this overthinking and analysing also helps my creativity. This is why it's so important to have a community around you that has an understanding of how you work and how you see the world. The people you spend time with are the people, when you're in this phase, are the people who nurture your garden. Creativity thrives on discipline, but it's easy to mistake discipline for control. For me, creativity is like a live beast, and I've spent my life trying to control my creative beast, but now I realise that control isn't the answer. Instead, we need to respect our creativity and give it boundaries and purpose. This is part of resilience, part of a healthy relationship with your creative practice so that it doesn't become your identity. And you can use your negative traits, such as overthinking, to serve you, not control you. Sometimes I can't control when ideas come. Sometimes I have the most fantastic, amazing ideas at 3 a.m. Or it might be on a day where I've promised to spend time with my children. It's important to me to spend time with my family and not disappoint them or myself by being distracted. So I need to set boundaries with myself and with my creative practice. I do this by quickly writing notes on my phone or always having a notepad with me. I honour my creativity by understanding that it might come at any time, and when it does, I need to get it out. But I don't allow it to consume me or to distract me when I've prioritised something else. If I don't let my creativity out, my garden becomes like a trash hoarder's garden. A messy mind so full of ideas that I can't make sense of any of them. This can then lead me to overwork myself to try and get the creativity out, and this leads to burnout. So I remember the 3 things that are important to me: living my purpose, connecting with people, and experiencing life. I respect my creativity, but I give it boundaries. Overthinking is something I'll probably always do. It's part of who I am, and as I mentioned, we're all wired to remember the negative. But what if instead of burning our energy trying to change or deny the negative traits that we all have, we use them to serve us and strengthen our resilience? I live with my fear and my failures on a daily basis. I don't deny them or even try to prevent them, because trying to prevent an overthinker from overthinking just amounts to more thinking. Failing at something means that I'm trying, I'm learning and I'm living, and that means success to me. And that positive and negative back and forth will help strengthen my resilience muscles. So I consider my overthinking a skill. I don't indulge it, and I do need to set boundaries, but my overthinking means that I would have been one of those cave women who lasted the longest because of my superior foresight and risk management skills. But eventually my critical self-talk and some negative experiences led me to lose the love of performing. I continued to do some TV commercials for a couple of years to pay the bills, but then my agent ran off with about $8,000 of my money and filed for bankruptcy. When this happened, I had a small part in a film, and I didn't know how I was going to continue paying my rent or what I was going to do with my life beyond performing. Then one day, the head of wardrobe quit, so I took a chance and said, I'll do it. This started a new phase of my career, backstage. I studied a diploma of makeup artistry and certificate 3 in hairdressing, and I worked as a stylist in film, theatre, photography, and fashion runway events. Soon after, I secured a role at a fashion company as their house stylist and then as a PR and creative coordinator. Project management, timelines, control, details, and aesthetics became my life. Perfectionism was something I was proud of. An impeccable eye for detail was my tagline. Creativity was replaced with profit-driven aspirational standards that were unattainable. At any given time, I had 3 campaigns running, one in pre-production, one in production, and one in post, as well as managing marketing and print installation for 110 national stores, national media, e-commerce styling, communication, copywriting, and large-scale fashion events. I was trying to prove myself worthy of space, trying to form a new identity, but the beast had control, and burnout was inevitable. What I discovered about work-life balance is that they are both part of the same story. Every part of your life needs balance. Work is not your identity, but it's also not separate from who you are. It's part of your purpose. Separating yourself from your work takes the humanity out of work, and that's what perpetuates no balance when we don't see work as human. What if you're an artist and while you're establishing your art, your job to pay the bills is working at a supermarket? You might say, well, that's not my life purpose. But what if we can find purpose in everything we do? What if seeing people coming into the supermarket every day going about their daily lives inspires your art? If you can find purpose in everything you do, you'll be more resilient to the challenges of life. Your work at the supermarket will not feel like it's at the detriment of your art because it will inform your art. After working in fashion for a few years, my mum was diagnosed with cancer, and fashion seemed meaningless. I had no purpose. I had become part of the machine. Of all of the images that I'd curated and the words that were printed in magazines, would I be happy if these were printed on my skin? What message was I sending? So once again, I spiraled into fear, quit my job, and doubted my identity. After my mum passed away, I was grieving, my mental health was suffering, and I was also trying to get pregnant. During this time, I worked as a curriculum designer, writing for a performing arts academy. I needed to be away from the spotlight and the hustle, so my husband and I decided on a tree change and moved to Ballarat. From a young age, I'd seen many doctors and specialists due to debilitating period pain, which was always dismissed as normal. This again built my resilience for pain, something that I would need later on in my story. It wasn't until I was 40 that I was finally diagnosed with endometriosis. I had an operation and miraculously 8 weeks later, I fell pregnant naturally. When my daughter was 1, I discovered I was pregnant with twin boys. At 7 months pregnant, I slipped and pulled the cartilage apart from my pelvis. It's now permanently separated at the pubic bone. I was hospitalised for a few days and then sent home to rest, looking after a 16-month-old baby pregnant with twins, unable to walk without a walking frame or a wheelchair. After I had the boys, I was still unable to walk and was in chronic pain, and there were no services to help me. My husband had been denied parental leave. His boss said, I have 3 children and I never took parental leave. However, now with my injury, his employer finally relented and he agreed to the standard 2 weeks, but only if my husband travelled overseas for a conference soon after. This broke me. I suffered from insomnia, anxiety and panic attacks. I was caring for 3 children under 18 months who were all waking at different times during the night, and I was unable to walk or lift my children without debilitating pain. Over the next several months, I had an overwhelming sense of fear that I couldn't keep my children safe. I asked my doctor, but what if I need to grab them and run? And he was puzzled and he said, what would you need to run from? I was running from my fear. Fear consumed me. Fear led me to doubt myself, my safety, and my sanity. I was completely powerless and I felt worthless. But now it wasn't just me. I had children to protect. In 2019, we decided to move back to Bendigo to be closer to family for support. On the day we moved and signed a new mortgage, that same employer made my husband redundant. He ended up securing a great role, and I started to look for work, wondering what my career options would be, living with a chronic injury and now 3 children under 3. Doctors said I may not be able to walk properly again and that I would have to live with chronic pain. At that stage, I couldn't work for longer than 5 minutes without my pelvis or legs giving way. I found it really hard to imagine a positive end to my story. And the next year, in 2020, we all know what happened. I already felt safe, but then overnight, everything changed and the entire world felt unsafe, just from the air that we breathed. These negative experiences were alongside the happiest time of my life, during the time that my children were born, and I had a little love bubble, is what we called it, during lockdown. When researchers study animals who become mothers, the focus is often on positive changes, looking at how this shift in cognition and behaviour affects the brain. But in humans, the focus is on the negative, the perception that women's brains turn to mush after pregnancy. We call it baby brain, and it's almost always associated with something negative. brain fog, trouble focusing and remembering certain things, and is often used to dismiss a woman's intellect and ability to function at work. Research shows that baby brain, a Stone Age survival switch that turns women into fierce protectors, is an evolutionary adaptation when a mother's brain changes to prioritise new skills that they need for motherhood and the survival of their children. This is an incredible transformation, yet many of the structures and systems in our society continue to undermine its power. My survival switch was in overdrive. I was in fight, flight and freeze mode daily. This overwhelming sense of joy, love, hope and powerful transcendence I felt as a mother sat beside fear, worthlessness, despair, pain and vulnerability. The full spectrum of human emotions all at once. My resilience muscles were stretched to capacity, and it took so much work, support, honesty and strength to build it back. My privileged position meant that I was able to do this. I had a supportive husband, family and friends around me, and private health cover, so I could afford rehabilitation physio and a mental health practitioner. But this doesn't make it easy, but it made the recovery achievable and sustainable. During these experiences, at the darkest moments, I really believed I was going to die. I didn't know how, it just felt destined and final. I couldn't find an alternate end to my story. I was consumed with wanting to leave my children with a legacy so that if I wasn't here, they would be able to learn the most important things in life, to value love and care above all else, to live with purpose, to connect with people, and to experience life. As I began to design this legacy, I began to live it myself, and I found my purpose and emerged out of the fire. In 2021, I studied to try and focus on something through the pandemic. I was at home with 3 children under 4 at this stage, so this study happened at night and in the early hours of the morning. I decided to join the incubator program with Emporium, and this was my lifeline. Studying helped my brain to focus on something else other than my children and the fear of all the negative things that could happen to them. Focusing on something else helped the survival switch in my brain to calm down. This is where the theory of art therapy comes from, and how creative artists can help themselves when their mental health is struggling. An important part of this is centering your purpose. I'd worked in creative areas before that didn't suit my purpose. Singing caused me to feel disconnection, acting caused me to overanalyze, and fashion caused me to be a perfectionist and burnout. What I did differently this time and through my time at the incubator was to work out my purpose, my sense of self, my legacy, and why I'm here on this planet. With this sense of purpose, my resilience muscle feels even stronger, because I believe that no matter what I face, no matter how many times I fail, I know where I'm going. My purpose gives me a destination. So when I've been told no, or I'm stuck at a crossroad, or I've fallen down into a pit of despair, I imagine my story. All stories have a problem, something that a protagonist is trying to overcome. So how do I want my story to end? How will I achieve my purpose? When I live in fear, I have a pattern of behaviour. I shut down, I become numb and isolate myself from loved ones. I don't prioritise my mental health. I lose relationships. I choose career over relationships. I don't take chances, and I live in fear. All of these things are within my control. And because I've been in this pattern before, I can now flex my resilience muscles and face taking charge of my own story. So if I feel myself shutting down and isolating myself, I now have the skills to ask for help. I do the work on my inner self and my mental health. I work on my relationships. My relationships take priority over my work. I take chances, and I live with my fear, but not in fear. My fear does not control me. This questioning of my fear, well, that was meant for before. I got stuck in story. This questioning of my fear, this sitting with my fear, recognising my fear, and then taking chances anyway, is what has built my resilience. And it doesn't always work out. In fact, most of the time, it doesn't. But all of the time I've taken risks and come out on the other side, whether I've failed or succeeded, I haven't regretted it because I've come out stronger and more resilient and more focused on my purpose. This time last year, I applied to be part of the 2022 Conflux event with Emporium. After a successful first meeting, my project was then denied. Thanks, Dave. And no, I was devastated because I really felt that it was my purpose. So I let myself be disappointed and upset for about 30 minutes, and Dave got that phone call. But then I flexed my resilience muscles and I asked for feedback. I went over the feedback and I took it on board and I used it and I redesigned my project. I kept asking questions, asking for more feedback, meeting with more people and showing them more ideas for my project. Eventually, the no turned into an opportunity and I monitored a panel discussion at the Conflux event. This helped me to shape and inform my project even more and to meet more people and receive more feedback. Interestingly, even though all of these positive things were happening, and it had turned into a yes, my brain was still wired to the negative. I received some positive feedback from after my panel discussion when someone said that it was exceptional. My first response was to overanalyze the word exceptional because it felt out of place, like why didn't he just say informative or great? So I went down a rabbit hole of stalking the person on LinkedIn. I just realised this is being videoed, anyway, to see if he was secretly conspiring with someone I knew. This experience made me realise that I can never take my resilience for granted. There will always be work to do. It's ongoing, like having to go to the gym. Like, can't I just go once to the gym and then I'm fit? Resilience is an ongoing exercise and journey. Throughout the obstacles I've faced, the creative industry has given me the skills I need to survive. Self-awareness, focus, adaptability, flexibility, creativity, collaboration, empathy, communication, storytelling, the ability to empower and influence others. But during the pandemic, at a time when the world desperately needed all of these things, the creative industry crumbled. The structures and foundations of the creative industry had been on borrowed time, in particular for women in the arts. This is because women, and not only in the arts, but in every industry, face negativity bias due to negative experiences such as sexual harassment, discrimination, the gender pay gap, and the motherhood penalty. Women have a weight around our necks, and the pandemic pulled us under. And again, for intersectional women, this load was even heavier. During my time at the incubator, I began to study the effects of the motherhood penalty and the underrepresentation of women in the arts, which brings me to the organisation I founded, We Are Untold, and the Women of Gold project. Now, I'll just let you know, I'm going to go through my organisation now and my project. There will be question time afterwards, so if you've got some questions that you'd like to think of them in your head. The art world devalues women in more ways than one. Historically, women's art and stories are underrepresented, while the physical identity of women has been objectified. The art world also has one of the largest pay gaps in any industry. In a study of 5,000 paintings, the study found that for every $1 a male artist earns for his work, a woman earns 10 cents. When a male artist signs their work, it's worth more than compared to an artwork that isn't signed. However, when a female artist signs her work, it's worth less. This devaluation happens at an early age. Research has revealed that the gender pay gap is even seen in children's pocket money. Boys earned up to 27% more than girls as they worked outside of the house on more labour-intensive chores, while girls typically had indoor chores and were paid less. So before they are even striving for success, girls have earned that they are worth less. Here is where we can start to see the parallels. The graph on the left shows the portion of words spoken by characters with more than 100 words for Academy Awarded Best Picture films between 1991 and 2016. As you can see, men far outweigh the women in speaking parts. 2 films have no female speaking more than 100 words at all. The graph on the left shows dialogue in Disney films where all male characters outweigh female characters, even in the Disney princess movies. A recent article identified that it continues to be unusual to find female barristers speaking before the High Court. Thank you to Sarah for passing this information to me. In more than half of the matters heard by the High Court over the 2015 to 16 financial year, not a single female barrister appeared at all, despite an average of 4 barristers in each case. When women did appear, very few had speaking parts. Male barristers spoke before the High Court 438 times, and female barristers spoke 42 times. In most cases, women were silent, playing a supporting role for the male barrister. Once you can see this cycle, you can't unsee it. It's everywhere, in every industry. The underrepresentation of women's stories in arts and culture creates a cycle of discrimination and impacts the ability for women to progress into positions of power. Because women's stories are underrepresented in the arts, this is reflected in our culture and it impacts other industries. Because women are underrepresented, they are voiceless, their perspectives are not heard, and policies are not based on the concerns and opinions of women, which leads to discrimination. This discrimination leads to women being undervalued, impacting the value of care, feminised industries, and the gender pay gap. And because women are not valued, their contributions aren't represented in history or public commemoration. Therefore, their stories are not considered important arts and culture, and the cycle continues. We need to change the stories and messages that we're documenting as part of our cultural landscape. We need to see women in positions of authority and power. We need to hear stories, opinions, perspectives and concerns from women. Changing the cultural representation of women is the only way to stop this cycle. So my organisation is aiming to change this cycle. By amplifying the voices of diverse women through cross-industry storytelling, we have the potential for prolific reach in the community. Through women's cross-industry stories, we inspire higher representation, workforce participation and visibility in the community. We normalise women having a voice. We normalise women being an authority. We break down stereotypical gendered roles. This leads to more women in positions of power and decision-making roles that inform policies based on women's perspectives. Policy breaks down outdated structures and barriers that discriminate against women. Women become visible and valued, which impacts the value of care, feminised roles, and the gender pay gap. Women and their contribution and perspectives are valued, so they're represented in public commemoration and history. And because they're part of our history, their stories become an important part of our arts and culture, and the cycle continues. The first project that we will do this with is the Women of Gold project. Women of Gold is a documentary and podcast series that showcases diverse groups of women who discuss their contributions to community, leadership, career, social care roles and motherhood. Female artists share in this journey as equal conversation participants and represent these stories and themes, creating public artwork to commemorate the contributions of these women. QR codes link the podcast and documentary series for visitors to listen and watch on smartphones, creating an immersive experience. Art is installed in outdoor, high foot traffic settings within a busy workplace environment to start conversations around gender equity in the workplace. Because it is located outdoors, the Women of Gold exhibition achieves maximum impact through accessible, meaningful engagement with community and visitors. High impact means greater success, more conversations around gender equity, social change and positive workplace culture, whilst also addressing the lack of female representation in public art and commemorations. Artwork and stories are updated every 12 months and are unveiled on International Women's Day. In 2026, to celebrate the Commonwealth Games, stories will represent women in sport. A Bendigo first, the Women of Gold project is scalable with the potential to represent other regional centres such as Ballarat and Geelong. AU, being the elemental symbol for gold, presents the opportunity to represent all women in Australia. Artists will be chosen by an independent panel consisting of diverse leaders in the creative arts industry. This will maintain fair and objective selection process and integrity and sustainability of the projects, with different artists representing different points of view from our community. The Women of Gold project has received funding so far through grants from City of Greater Bendigo and Creative Victoria through the Creative Projects Fund. These were the first grants I had applied for, and I really didn't think I'd be successful, but I just went for it. I studied the creative strategy and the gender equity strategy and made sure that the project aligned. I'm currently sourcing more funding to realise the concept I've presented. But part of resilience is flexibility and adaptability. So coming up with a backup plan and options to run with if things don't work out as I'd planned. I have a smaller concept that I'll roll out this year until I have enough funding for the large concept. This will keep the momentum rolling and also helps to secure more funding. As I'm building the profile and governance of We Are Untold, which is a not-for-profit, I've also recently launched or had a launch event with the support of Be Bendigo. I have the space at Exhibit B on Mitchell Street coming up in May to generate interest and collaboration in the project. So this project and organisation that I'm building was conceived in a time of fear, out of love for my children and through the transcendence of motherhood that overwhelmed and informed my story. And through the process of developing, refining, receiving feedback and taking chances, I've discovered my purpose, power and resilience. And also, if there's any questions or if you'd like to know any of the resources from today, any of the reports, I can also post those or I can message them to you. Let me know. So there's a microphone here. If anybody has any questions, just the microphone is purely for because we are recording. If you've got any questions, do you have a question? No, sorry. You just look too excited to talk. Any questions from anyone? It's not. Yay, Sarah, yeah.
I'm just sharing a thought to hopefully inspire and give other people time to ask questions as well. But I'm sort of wondering, just anecdotally, I see a huge number of women who have babies and then blow up their lives. And what I mean by that is they don't go back to their job they had before, or they start pursuing a creative passion or something like that. Is there any stats or, does anybody study what happens to women when they have babies in terms of their career?
Awesome question, thank you. That's something I'm definitely interested in finding more about. I went to the Gina Davis seminar a couple of weeks ago through ACME. So Gina Davis runs the Gina Davis Institute of Gender Representation in Media. And I actually asked them that same question, and they have replied. So they're actually doing a report that will come out in September, and it's based upon motherhood representation in media and how that then filters onto our society's view of motherhood. But what is really interesting, obviously, probably in the last 20 years, there has been a thing called the I don't know how to say it, entrepreneur, mumpreneur? Yeah. And it's a thing, and there's two reasons for that. One is exactly what you say, women don't go back to work because the way that work previously, pre-pandemic, the way it was structured was just not suitable for mothers, having to be at a job 9 to 5, needing to be able to pick up children from school, doing most of the care for children and domestic work at home did not suit women going back into the workplace, which is why women either chose not to go back into the workplace or had to choose roles that potentially weren't actually what they were trained in, so roles where they were paid less. And then the other thing is what I was talking about before, is that evolutionary switch that we have, that where you gain that skill, the skills that you need, what we call baby brain, where you learn to prioritise the care that you need to give your child to survive. The change in that brain actually gives women that sense of power that possibly they've never had before. And I know from my own personal experience that being a mother was the first time I'd ever had a role where I really felt that I owned it completely, fully, and nobody could take that away from me. And that did give me a sense of power, because women, obviously, as we know with all the stats, don't often have that sense of power. It really gives them that kind of, inspires them to say, well, I am going to take charge of my life. I can't go back to what I was doing because it doesn't suit being a mother. But I now have this sense of power and confidence to then go and change and become an entrepreneur and actually take charge of my life and my story. So it would be a really interesting study to do that. I would love to, in my spare time, to do something like that. But I'm definitely trying to find out more about that. And if there are a few studies done about women, female artists. There's one great study that was done by the Freelance freelance organisation in Britain in 2020 that came out, and a book written by Hetty Judah. And that is about the fact that galleries and artistic institutions don't support parents, so we don't often see women from a particular age as artists, because once they become mothers, they just can't fit back in, because having an exhibition means generally that you need to go to your openings, which are late at night, or you might need to travel. You need to have time to kind of pursue your own creative practice, and it just doesn't suit once you become a mother. So there have started to be a few more reports done on that. And that goes, I suppose, for many other industries, such as tech and science, and those things where you need to keep your skills up, you need to keep learning. There's obviously a big chunk of time after women become mothers where they're not progressing, and if you are working in a tech industry that is continually changing, it's very easy to fall behind. So there's hopefully more reports coming out in that respect.
That's great. Yeah. Meg, I'm Mary.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm Mary. I was just really sort of impressed that at the beginning of your talk you acknowledged your own privilege, and I think that's really unusual but also really important, because some time ago I did some work or research on working class women artists and the barriers that they face in progressing with their careers. And I think it's sort of like a pretty sort of unmapped area, So I was just really impressed that you did that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a really important point. Art and any artistic field and sport in that matter, any field that possibly when you first start out doesn't pay the bills, what it requires is for you to either have a job to support yourself or to have money. So what we find is that there are a lot of artists who have made it the big time. They actually have that financial support behind them, whether that be, from family, inheritance, or whatever it might be. So people that don't have that means that we're not hearing those stories. And that means that all of the stories that we're seeing on film, the books that we're reading, the art that we're seeing, the music that we're hearing is only coming from a particular part of society, which often may not be the part of society that we need to hear about, because we obviously do already see a lot of stories in media and on news about white privileged society. So it's important to be able to acknowledge that and to say that we do need to hear more stories from everyone. And I think from my point of view, from my story, I really kind of recognised my privilege when I was injured, because there is the possibility that, and what happened in that stage was that when my husband was made redundant, even though that was obviously a bad thing, unfortunately at the same time my grandmother passed away, and although that was really hard, what that meant was she actually did leave us some money so we could actually keep our house, because we had just signed a new mortgage and my husband was made redundant and we had no way of paying to live. And it made me think, number one, the reason, because my husband was home, he could help me with the children because I was still in pain and couldn't really walk. It also meant that I could go and do physio. I had private health cover, but I still had to be able to pay, the top of that. What it made me realise is that if we hadn't had the money to do that, my injury could have been permanent. I would never have been able to, build my body back to then be able to begin to walk properly again, for long periods of time. Number two, we might not have had a house. So we might have had 3 children, me with an injury and nowhere to live. And the only thing that changed that was my grandmother passing away. So there would be obviously so many stories of people out there that don't have that to fall back on, and it puts them in a place that they never recover from. Yeah.
It's like Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. In that essay, she says for a female writer to be successful, she needs £500 a year and a room of her own. Yeah, so anyway, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg. That was amazing. I just want to acknowledge that we're in a heavily female identifying audience here, and I was just curious to hear your thoughts on how we start to have conversations and presentations and connections that are far more diverse, so that we can start to get this message out and really affect change.
Yeah. So part of the organisation, so the first project is obviously Women of Gold, and it will be telling stories about women, because that obviously needs to happen because we haven't heard the stories from women. But the next project after that, and the next part of the organisation is about including men in the conversation, and that really needs to happen. And the reason it's important is that we need to hear from men and them talking about their caring roles, and we need to switch that kind of narrative, because until men talk about the same things that women talk about, life, family, the juggle, the making different choices about your career, and having care, whether that be care of children or care in the community, looking after elderly parents, all of those things, until men don't talk about that, it's always going to fall back on the same kind of society that we've all kind of grown up with, where it's a woman's job to kind of pick up those pieces for our community. So we need to hear from men in that respect, and it's inviting them into the conversation to talk about how it feels, because I think, I think at the moment it can feel a little bit scary, and I'm not looking at you for that you don't have to answer, but or Bailey, but it can feel almost a little bit scary to be a man at this time, because the fact is that we're asking men to change, and the biggest part that's going to happen with gender equity is the lives of men are going to have to change. But at the moment, the way that the structure is set up, they actually can't. In my story, my husband was denied parental leave. It's not because he didn't want to do it, he was actually denied. So there are many people out there that want to change, but the way that everything is set up right now, it's impossible. So what we are asking seems like an impossible feat. So I think that we need to also acknowledge, how hard that is, and give them the chance to speak about how that feels as well. So I think it's just about conversation. And once we have a few kind of male advocates that will go out there and start, talking about it, then that will kind of progress, and that will be what the project will be about, is having males join the stories and talk about it from their perspective, and then go into workplaces and talk about, so I went on parental leave, this is what I did, this is what I found out becoming a parent, this is what I found out changing my work hours to working part-time. And that's the big issue at the moment, is that until it's a normalised thing to be able to work part-time and work flexibly, the motherhood penalty and the gender pay gap is always going to be there. And the problem with that is that it affects everyone. It's whether you're a parent or whether you're not. It doesn't actually matter whether you're a woman, a mother or not. It affects every woman. And it also affects men too, because men are forced really to work full-time and not be able to have that choice over how they live their lives at the moment. So we need to start that conversation and invite men in, and I guess that's obviously going to be a really long process, but I think infiltrating workplaces is the most important thing, and that is why I have set the structure of the project up like this, because having an art exhibition, I was worried that the same people who love art are often more kind of open to this discussion and conversation anyway. But we really need to go into workplaces and parts of the community who may not have thought about this before, who may not be aware of the challenges that people face, who have lived different lives and haven't had these conversations. And that's why we need to go into workplaces to kind of create that change from within. Yeah. Mm. Mm.
I just want to say you're awesome, Meg, and thank you. No, every time I hear you speak, it's beautiful. You're so brave, and just thank you for sharing so vulnerably. I've heard your story before, but that was really, really hits home, and I think it inspires everybody. It's very relatable. Not exactly, but, we're all in our heads, and
And I think, you know, I think that's the thing, isn't it, is that everybody is, well, not the same, but kind of the same. Like, we all have these experiences, and I think we often don't share it, and that's part of the problem, is that we're not hearing all of those stories from all of the different people. And I think that once we are hearing them, hopefully, that does change, you know, perspectives and people and structures and life. I mean, it's a big project, isn't it? It's a big want to kind of change the world, but and I think that goes back to what you're saying. I think, you know, when women do become mothers, and not all women, but a lot of the time, the reason that you do change so much is because you see those little vulnerable children, and you want the world to be better for them, and that is what makes it so powerful. And when I went to the Gina Davis seminar, I found out that we're actually really similar. So she's got 3 kids and has twins. And she, I mean, obviously, you know, she's been to the Olympics, and she's obviously incredibly tall and wealthy and famous, so maybe those things, not so much. But she started her foundation, what's it called? Institute, after becoming children, because she was reading books to her kids and couldn't believe that there were no female characters. And so that was 17 years ago. And obviously, because of her fame and contacts and money and all of those things, she has had like widespread, you know, recognition and success in that. So she has actually changed a lot in that time, in the last 17 years, in the way that the media, particularly the way that children's programs are kind of, what's that word, you know, monitored. Yeah, so I think that is all being part of her story, and I think that's the power that it has. Yeah.
It is, yeah. So thanks for pushing through your fear, and I think it's that idea of looking into the future. Like, I mean, you may see this all unfold in your lifetime, or it might be seeds that you plant. You know, like if we plant a tree, we might not get to see it grown, but our children and our children's children will. So, yeah.
Oh, I don't have anything to say. I'm probably the same as Lauren, that like, you're amazing and I love you, and it's hard for me to say anything. I've known you for 34 years, so I've witnessed so much of your journey. I'm just very proud of you. Can't say anything.
Hi there, my name is Ivan. I just wanted to share a few thoughts, and thank you so much for your wonderful speech and presentation. Just want to share some thoughts as a man, as an artist, a writer, as a migrant as well, that when I was growing up and I was, you know, discovering literature and art, I've always found the female writers, the female artists more interesting. You know, I don't know if it's because I came from a non-English speaking background. Maybe the, you know, female art that I explored and discovered spoke more to the intuitive, the spiritual maybe, or the internal, just a thought. And Virginia Woolf as well, you know, she was a writer that you know, I particularly respected and read a lot of. So sometimes I wonder if with hindsight, you know, history can reevaluate the male versus female artists, writers, directors that we have today, and reverse the balance. You know, for instance, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Back in their days, he was the major, well-known artist, and she was a really lesser-known figure. But history has kind of turned that around.
And there actually has been, so you know the book, I can never pronounce the name, you know the book of art, the story of art by Gombrich. Yeah, so that is actually, there's just been a new one that's has come out, I think it's this year, or maybe it was last year, but it's actually all females, because, you know, for the last 50 years or whatever, that has been the textbook for artists to have when they go to school, and there was never any women artists in there. I think Frida Kahlo made it in maybe 10 years ago. But yeah, there was just no female artists in that book, so they've actually just released one. And I think there is a lot of that going back. They're trying to discover more, you know, especially female directors. So I was actually reading something the other day, and then I saw the film Babylon. It's not awesome. so don't recommend it. But it was enjoyable. But it made me kind of revisit something that in the silent film era, women were actually, there were a lot of female directors and producers, and that was in the 1920s. And it wasn't until Hollywood became such a kind of a machine, that women were kind of, made to, when the talkies started, women were kind of made to, be more in the background. And there's this kind of thing that when something starts to make money rather than be creative, that it has been more of a white man's domain. But there have been women throughout history that across every art form that have been there doing the work. But unfortunately, when it comes to things like music, from hundreds of years ago, obviously there was no recording, so we don't have that anymore. There are some, places that are trying to kind of find history and find stories about these people. There was a podcast, I think, on the ABC that somebody told me about, and it's recreating music that was written by women from like the 16th, 17th century, and they are only, obviously they don't have it, it's not notated, so that doesn't exist, but they are kind of making it up in the style of, finding out the history of these women and their story and trying to imagine what it could have been like, because those things are lost. But obviously, with artwork and, and then later on photographs and things, we can still kind of hopefully uncover those one day. But there are some obviously from a long time ago that will just be lost forever because, they can't be rediscovered, which is really sad. So I think, as long as we can try as much as we can to, I think, find out as much information and as different information as we can. And I think that's what is happening at schools at the moment, is that we are having, our education has come from the same place, and our history is based on his story a lot, and it's obviously a white man's story as well. And I think that when we do hear information about something, I think people now, obviously with the rise of the internet and Google, we are now going, okay, well, is that the story, or can I find out more information about something? And I think that's what we kind of all need to do, to try and find out the rest of the story, the rest of history, from women from all different cultures. Yeah. Thank you.
I was just going to comment on we can't have resilience without the vulnerability. And I think that's a really, really important place to be within these conversations, because we're scared of being vulnerable. And I, appreciate your vulnerability in this space, that, it prompts us to be open and present with our own stories, whatever they might be. So that sharing of the, being vulnerable in spaces that we're not necessarily allowed to be, like workplaces and more corporate spaces, because we're actually so used to containing ourselves, but we actually need to be more vulnerable so these kinds of stories can connect us.
And that's right, because there is no strength without vulnerability, because it's like the analogy of the tree. If the tree isn't flexible and soft, then it will break, and you need to be able to have that softness to be able to kind of withstand the wind and the weather. So having that kind of veneer of strength all the time is actually going to come undone eventually. So being able to have both that vulnerability and then strength is what resilience is about, that elasticity. Yeah.
Just on that, and as perhaps a little warning for people, I was at Meg's launch with Be Bendigo and had a moment. It was a magnificent launch. It was fantastic, and we'd had discussions with Meg in the lead up and all of that sort of stuff. And And I got home, I reckon it was maybe a couple of days later even, and I just had a moment. I'm a bit of an overthinker as well. And I was thinking, and I was working, and I was just going about my daily life. But I had a moment at home where I just went, whoa. And I just started crying. And my partner was a bit like, oh my, are you okay? And I was just like, I'm totally fine. But I just had that moment where it kind of washed over me and I went, wow, you know, having these conversations are really important. And it did prompt me to kind of go out and go, right, you know, I'm going to have a conversation with this person today and I'm going to talk about blah, 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 or that sort of thing. So, yeah, it does make you brave, I think, to be vulnerable and to have important conversations with workmates and all that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Thank you. And I think it's hard too sometimes to have the conversations because you also, you know, you don't want to, well, I don't want to impose on forcing other people to feel vulnerable as well if they don't choose to. So we're at that kind of time, you know, where when I was saying before about asking men how they feel, we're also at that kind of time where we're just really starting to talk about a lot of things that maybe weren't talked about in the 80s or the 50s. So it's in a bit of a cross, you know, phase where it can be hard sometimes and people can not want that, and you do need to give trigger warnings or, you know, like so it can be hard. You don't know how it's going to come across sometimes. And I was really aware of that too when it was the first times that I had said some of those things out loud, and I was a bit aware that I didn't want to bring up other stuff for people, but at the same time I did. That's the whole point of it. So, you know, it's just, it's one of that, it's a bit catch-22, isn't it? Yeah. Mm.